Of August 1949 brought newspaper reporters from all over the country to cover the trial of the Groveland boys, a case the press was calling Little Scottsboro. Certainly it was strikingly similar in many ways to the infamous 1931 case, in which a young white woman's accusations of rape by young black men triggered coerced confessions, lynchings, and mob violence involving powerful sheriffs and unruly gangs, and the Ku Klux Klan in Scottsboro, Alabama. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America, author Gilbert King tells the story of the Groveland Boys and Thurgood Marshall's defense of them. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gilbert King. I think a good place to start, Mr. King, is what drew you to write a book about Thurgood Marshall?
Sure. Well, I started out back in 2005. I was working on a book it was called The Execution of Willie Francis, and it was a story of a 46-year-old kid in Louisiana, African-American kid, who had been convicted of murder and sentenced to the electric chair. And a 16-year-old kid was about to go to the chair in 1946. And what happened was kind of unbelievable. The executioners, was a traveling electric chair. The executioners were drinking and set up the chair wrong. So he got all this electricity, but not enough to kill him. And so what happened was they didn't know what to do with him. They threw him in a cell and said, what do we do? Called the governor. The governor said, fix the chair, send him back in. And finally, a young lawyer came in and sort of put a halt to it. And it became this very big Supreme Court case. And as I was researching this and writing, I kept seeing Thurgood Marshall's name in the outlaying section of this story. He wasn't representing this young man, but he was actually advising the lawyers and trying to really help save this kid's life. And it was amazing that he was working outside the law. I thought that was fascinating. He was reaching out to movie stars. He was reaching out to local clergy, trying all these different things outside of the law to save this kid's life. And I just found it kind of fascinating and thought he was ahead of his time this way. And I just started looking at some of his other earlier criminal cases that he was involved in that I had never heard of. And I stumbled onto this one.
You know, I want to talk to you about where this book takes place. It takes place in Florida. And I was trying to get a flavor of what Florida was like during this period. And I'm going to read a letter that Thurgood Marshall wrote in 1944. It's dated January 28, 1944, and I'd like you to comment because I think it may give the audience a little flavor of what Florida was like. And this was a letter that Thurgood Marshall wrote to Senator Claude Pepper in 1944. It goes, Dear Senator Pepper, yesterday the War Department released stories of Japanese torture and inhumane treatment of American boys in prison camps after the fall of Corregidor. At the same time, numerous letters reached our office concerning a vicious crime committed in Live Oak, Florida. During the first week in January, a 14-year-old Negro boy living in Live Oak was taken from his home by 3 men, tied hand and foot, and drowned in the Suwannee River. The only offense committed by this boy was the alleged passing of a note to a white girl in the store where they worked. The body was turned over to the local colored undertaker. The boy's father has been threatened not to talk under penalty of similar treatment, and it's our understanding that he has sold his property and left town. This is the type of material that Radio Tokyo is constantly on the alert for and will use effectively in attempting to offset our very legitimate protest in respect to the handling of American citizens. We respectfully request that you use your very good offices and influence to urge an investigation of this matter through the appropriate officers for the purpose of bringing to trial the perpetrators of this uncivilized act. With best wishes, respectfully yours, Thurgood Marshall. Now, today this letter seems shocking, But in your research about Florida and Thurgood Marshall during this time, was such a letter like that really shocking? I mean, things like that really occurred.
You know, I went through all his files, and it's amazing how many letters are like that. And I actually write about this story in the book because it was one of Thurgood Marshall's earlier trips to Florida where he experienced this. And I think a lot of people are familiar with Emmett Till in 1955, and a lot of people think, well, that was the first case that sort of brought the cruelty towards children into the American conscience. And in fact, this was a 14-year-old kid in Live Oak, Florida, who was really, his only sin was writing a Valentine's Day card to a white girl who worked in the same drugstore as him. And he was dragged out, just like the letter said, and his father was actually forced to witness this. And it was the local postmaster who was also the father of this girl. And they basically pointed a gun at this kid and said, either take a bullet or jump in that river. And he stumbled back into the river, and the father was taken down to the courthouse and forced to sign an affidavit saying he just witnessed an accident involving his son. And those were the kind of cases that Marshall was up against, and the intimidation. And of course, that case never went anywhere. No one's ever heard of this case, and it just kind of died quietly in the files.
You know, we don't think of Florida typically the way that we think of Mississippi and Alabama during those days. But Florida had its own history and its own troubles. What were you able to find out about how Florida was compared to those states that most people think about during that period?
Well, you know, what's shocking is I found out it was worse. I mean, the per capita lynchings in Florida were greater than any other state in America, in the South, but, you know, in the time. You had a tremendous amount of violence that was happening, and it just did not get the same scrutiny as the Cotton Belt states, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. And I write about that in the book. I call it Florida was considered south of the South. It really wasn't on the radar. So these kind of stories where this young kid is basically lynched on the side of a river, nobody knows about them. The Groveland story, really nobody really knows about this story. We're all familiar with the Scottsboro boys. Well, that happened in Alabama in 1931. Here's a story that happened in 1949, far more violent than the Scottsboro boys, and yet people are just learning about it now.
Well, I'd like to follow up. How did you come upon the story of the Groveland boys?
Well, what's interesting is as I was going through the files, I had access to all of Thurgood Marshall's files, the NAACP papers. And I just started going through and reading letters just like the one you just read. And they're very emotional ones. A lot of the letters are actually really tragic, and they're the fathers and mothers of these young African-American girls in the South who have been raped by usually white policemen, was what was very common. And nothing is ever done about it. There's no prosecution or anything. And Marshall would get these letters on his desk, and he'd have to write back these responses. There's nothing I can do. We're not a legal aid society. You have to force prosecution. But the only thing Marshall could do was he could defend men who were falsely accused of rape. And he had his pick. There were a lot of these cases that were coming in. Virginia, for example, had, I think, 60 men who were executed for rape. All 60 of them were black men accused and convicted of raping white women. So that was the most unjust form of justice, the prosecution of these cases. And when I saw this case in the letters, these personal appeals just help us. They're very emotional, and I followed up on them.
Just to get a geographical perspective, where is Groveland?
Groveland is about a half hour west of Disney World, I would guess, maybe 40 minutes. So, you know, that's another thing. People, when they think Florida, I tell them the story I was working on, they go, well, Florida, that's not really the South. It's not really that bad. I say, come take a ride with me sometime. And I go into these areas in Groveland, and they seem lost in time. It's just like really parts of Mississippi and Louisiana that I've seen. So.
You know, in your book, you talk about the justice system, obviously, and you talk specifically about one of the sheriffs, one of the southern sheriffs that we hear about so many times when we think of Bull Connor or Jim Clark in Alabama and Mississippi. But there was a sheriff in Groveland by the name of Willis McCall. And could you sort of describe for the audience Willis McCall, the power, and how he was able to exercise the power in Groveland?
Well, I mean, at the time, Southern sheriffs did wield a lot of power. But in my research, I've never really come across a sheriff who had this much power. He actually served for 28 years. And this was 2 decades after all these atrocities became public knowledge, it wasn't enough to not get him elected. And you know, there's a saying in Lake County that I've heard on countless times, and I write about it in the book. They say the citrus groves of Lake County are fertilized with the bodies of black men. And every time I go back, I hear stories, you know, lynching statistics are one thing, but a lot of times there's the missing, the men who just suddenly had a run-in with the sheriff's department and went missing, and their relatives have never heard of them again. I don't think they were migrating. And also the resisting arrest. I mean, that's another thing that you would hear about in Groveland, you know, all these cases where he was shot resisting arrest. And, you know, there's no witnesses. No one's going to question the sheriff and the deputy's version of events, which is really what forms the basis of this book, is a story that's put in place by the sheriff of an escape attempt. And it has tragic consequences, but that was the kind of man. He was just really put into power by the citrus grove owners, but once he got power, he really answered to the Klan and the people of Lake County.
I want to follow up on that because your story infers that perhaps one of the reasons that justice was not particularly served in this case was the interest of agriculture and business. And how did that all play into this story?
Well, it's an interesting thing that plays out. You know, after these alleged rape allegations start, the Ku Klux Klan rolls into Groveland and starts burning down black homes in Groveland, and they chase hundreds of people into the swamps. And that creates an economic problem. And so what happened was labor in the citrus grove was the most important part, and they did not want another rosewood. And so you had the wealthier citrus barons who were actually trying to protect the African Americans. They were loading them up on trucks and saying, you got to get out of here, the Klan is coming, we're going to protect you. And so they had learned from earlier rosewood. Now, I'm not saying they were racially enlightened people, but they definitely recognized their economic interests. And so it was imperative that they not lose this labor force. And so after the Klan left, they were able to bring people back and keep the production and the picking happening in the citrus groves.
For those who may not be familiar with, could you just tell the audience a little bit about what happened at Rosewood?
Well, Rosewood was a sort of a very similar case where a young woman's accusations of being attacked by an African American who had escaped prison. And then basically there was a mass exodus. The Klan and the whites in Rosewood just drove every single black person out of Rosewood. And there's a movie about it, there's some books as well. But that presented a lot of problems for the economic interests in Rosewood. They lost the labor force, and they were pretty much wiped from that town. And so it was pretty much known in the South that you sort of had to protect your interests, and your interests were basically human interests, labor.
You know, there's a lot of mention of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, in your book. And I think for many people, when we think about the Ku Klux Klan, we sort of have this birth of a nation image of these people riding around with sheets and hoods and nobody really thinking that they're an organized force. But in Florida, during this period of time, they were actually a political force.
They really were. I mean, and you could look at some of the statistics where they'll say, you know, this percentage of whites belong to the Klan, and that doesn't mean they're out there night riding, but they were definitely organized, and it was, you know, it was a sort of underground movement, but it reached the highest level of politics. And, you know, at the time you had Hugo Black, who was actually admitted that he was in the Klan. He was a Supreme Court justice. He had to get on the radio and make an address because they thought they were going to kick him off. He had to make an address saying, yes, I was in the Klan, but it was the way things worked. I had to do it if I wanted to work. And so the Klan was extremely active, and in Lake County they were just very powerful.
Well, let's talk about Thurgood Marshall's role in this. Certainly, and we read a letter that Thurgood wrote, and certainly the NAACP offices received all of these letters. What was it about this case, and what was it about Thurgood that he wanted to take this case on?
Well, I think Thurgood had a couple prerequisites for getting involved in these kind of criminal cases because, you know, at the time, Thurgood Marshall was involved in the civil rights movement. He was doing the landmark cases like the voting rights cases, the housing cases, and the school cases, which later, well, at the same time, these 4 school cases were rolled up into one, which became Brown versus Board. And so that case was finally brought before the Supreme Court in 1954. But in fact, they were litigating this right at the same time as Groveland. And so Marshall's fellow lawyers and advisors were saying, Thurgood, why are you going down to this Klan-infested county in Florida? We need you arguing these truly important cases. And Marshall felt like these are important cases. People's lives are on the line. And he felt that this was a necessary part of the American dream. Here he is doing the school cases, the housing, the voting rights, but the place where Marshall works, the courthouse, was seeing the most injustice of them all. And so he felt compelled to argue these kind of cases, especially when he knew that the people who were accused were innocent and facing the electric chair.
You know, when we talk about Thurgood Marshall, we're talking about an African-American lawyer at the time, working for the NAACP, coming into this hostile environment, not only Florida, but all over the South. You know, what was it about Thurgood Marshall that made him effective? And what was it about Thurgood Marshall that allowed him to survive what apparently was a very, very hostile environment?
Well, how he survived, I'm not quite sure. There were definitely some very close calls. But in my experience, I think one of the things that really made him effective was the fact that he could go into a courtroom and he wasn't very provocative. He just acted like another lawyer. And all the time I would hear, like, Thurgood would really get along with a lot of sheriffs, like he would win them over. And the opposing counsel would start to say, he's good, he's arguing the law. In this particular case, I have the prosecutor, and it's a long drawn out case, and the prosecutor does some very vicious things. But in the end, the prosecutor had a change of heart, and he attributed it to his interactions with Thurgood Marshall. And he's in the middle of the trial, he goes, that's a great man. That man knows more law than any man in this building. And he was won over, and a lot of people were won over him. And I think that, if you watch this one-man show, you will see really an understanding of what kind of a dynamic personality he was. He was extremely likable and charismatic, and he had the intellect to really back everything up. And so I think that's what made him effective. He was just another good lawyer, and people really respected that across the race line.
What was he like as a person? I mean, from the play, we see that there is a sense of humor. We see that he does drink, he smokes. What did you come away with in terms of his character, his personality? I fell in love with the guy. I couldn't believe that I was writing about this guy and he wasn't a fiction character. I was reading things like, things would just hit me all of a sudden. Like, Thurgood Marshall at one point had 5 lawyers working for him. 2 of them were women, and this was 1945. There were no law firms in New York City who were hiring women. But Marshall didn't think anything of it. And Constance Baker Motley was, one of those lawyers. She represented James Meredith in the big Mississippi school case, later went on to be a judge. And she talks about Thurgood Marshall saying, he didn't think anything about hiring women. His mother was a professional school teacher, studied at Columbia. He knew women were competent. He just didn't care about that. He wasn't doing some kind of, racial quota or affirmative action in his office. He just said women can do this job just as well as men. And so Constance Baker Motley called him the first feminist. Let's talk about his trial strategy and his trial skills, because a lot of people know Thurgood Marshall as a Supreme Court justice, but his trial career as a trial lawyer is pretty interesting. Did he ever think he had a shot, not only in a case like this in Groveland, but throughout the South? Was his strategy to try to win these cases? And if he was, how did he go about doing it? What was his ultimate strategy in representing people like the Groveland boys?
Well, that's a great question, because it sort of flies in the face of what your common perception of these kind of trials. Everybody looks at like these kind of cases that Thurgood was involved in, and they look at like Atticus Finch, To Kill a Mockingbird. Wait for that jury, and let's just see that drama. It's going to be close, And the fact is that never happened. Rarely did it happen. There was a case, Lyons versus Oklahoma, which became a Supreme Court case. And Marshall, I saw his correspondence early on. It was a case of a sharecropper who was accused of burning down a home and killing this family. Had nothing to do with it. It was actually a furloughed prisoner who was let out who did this. But at the time, Marshall had to defend him, and there's his note back home to the NAACP. He said, jury, terrible, no chance here. And he knew right away. It was 12 white jurors, 12 farmers, basically. And at the time in the South, what was happening was prosecution just had their way with the jurors. They were fellow community members, and there were expectations to be in that community. And we are sending away a black man to the electric chair. You know which way to vote. So Marshall knew he was never going to win. What his strategy was to just find those appealable issues, to look for things that the Supreme Court had already ruled on. One of them, the big one that he used a lot, was coerced confessions. In 1940, Thurgood Marshall argued this case before the Supreme Court, Chambers versus Florida. And the Supreme Court ruled that you could not beat a suspect, get a confession out of him, and then take that into court. Well, that didn't stop it from happening. For years, it kept happening. And so Marshall was able to go up there and get testimony from deputies and say, yeah, we beat him, and then he finally told the truth. So once those words appeared in the transcript, Marshall would just go, aha, now I got something where I know the Supreme Court will rule on. I will get this reversed. And so that was his strategy, to just stay, he was always a step ahead of the prosecutors. He might get run over in these local trials, but he knew that when he got to the Supreme Court, that was a level playing field.
You know, to give it some sort of perspective, there's a part in your book when you talk about when Marshall gets a plea offer for one of the Groveland boys.
Right.
And the plea offer is a prison sentence. It's practically a life sentence.
Right.
And Marshall's enthusiastic about that sentence. And he actually, it appears, wants the suspect to seriously consider it. What was that going through his mind, that perhaps this was a very good deal for someone who is denying their guilt?
Right, and that's a horrible reality to witness. And a lot of people on the outside said, Thurgood, Marshall, how could you do something like that? You're representing this client. How could you encourage him to plead to a life sentence? It sounds like the worst thing possible. Well, the fact is, Marshall's experience in these death penalty cases was that there was very little stopping states from convicting and sentencing and carrying out these executions. A lot of times they would happen within 2 months of the actual arrest. So Marshall had seen this countless times. Just earlier in the year, when I'm talking about this case in the book, there was the Martinsville 7. 7 men accused, convicted, and sentenced to the electric chair in Virginia. And one after another, every 15 minutes, Virginia sent these men to the chair. And Marshall had to stand there and talk to the mothers of these young men and basically apologize. I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. So when the prosecutor offered the deal to one of the last Groveland boy to take life in prison, Marshall was like, do it. We will get you in jail. We can work on saving you later, but this will save your life. And he says to him, Florida's going to kill you. Make no mistake.
I was wondering if you could share the story in that book of what that Groveland boy does when confronted with that.
Right. Well, here's Walter Irvin, who in the book, after these accusations, he didn't flee town. He stuck around because he didn't do anything. And he had a chance in the trial to tell where he was on that night, and he could have lied about that. He could have helped his alibi. And they asked him, what time did you come home that night? And he says, I don't recall. And he says that in the transcript. Could have helped himself there. He was beaten mercilessly by the deputies, and he wouldn't confess. He just passed out from the pain. And when it came time to save his life, to take that, he was offered this deal from the governor: plead guilty, admit that you raped this young woman, and you will get life in prison, and then later on we can work about getting you out of there. But the governor was basically saying, let some time blow over before we work on freeing you. It's pretty obvious that he was innocent. And Marshall just pleads with him, saying, they're going to kill you. And Irvin talks to his mother and says, I'll do it. What do I got to do? And Marshall says, you got to admit that you raped Norma Paget. And he says, all right, well, you say it. And Marshall says, no, it has to come from your lips. And Irvin says, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to tell a lie on myself. And he refused to take that deal. And of course, he was convicted and sentenced to the electric chair, just as Marshall predicted.
And Marshall had seen this happen over and over again.
Over and over.
I want to talk about some of the people that are brought up in the play and are also brought up in your book. And a name that we hear in terms of the formation of who Thurgood Marshall is as a person is Charles Hamilton Houston. Who is Charles Hamilton Houston?
Well, Charles Hamilton Houston is really the only way to describe him is just to consider the best and the brightest of American lawyers. in America, and that's who Charles Hamilton Houston was. He, he studied at Harvard. He was a brilliant, brilliant lawyer, passed up a career, a well-paying career, to basically teach law at Howard University. And so he was really shaping countless young lawyers at a time where no other schools would accept African Americans to study law. And, Howard had this extreme work ethic. He used to say, listen, if you're going to be a lawyer, you better practice social justice and social engineering, otherwise you're a parasite. And that was the influence that he placed. And I've met countless people who've studied under Charles Hamilton Houston, and they all had this unbelievable work ethic. Marshall has a story early in the book when I write about where, Hamilton Houston had to tell him, look, you better be 100% better than your white lawyers because you're not going to get one single advantage. So Marshall knew that when he filed a plea, everything better be exactly right because he was really representing a race of young black lawyers. And that was the beauty and the power that Charles Hamilton Houston instilled in his pupils, and Thurgood Marshall was his star pupil.
When we think of Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, we usually think of the term Brown versus Board of Education. What's a criminal case like what happened in Groveland doing in the box of tools of the cases that Thurgood Marshall handled? Why isn't he mostly dealing with just social causes instead of these criminal cases?
That's a really good question, and that was sort of the pull within the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. They were like, Thurgood, why are we taking these cases? They pull up a lot of man hours. And Marshall figured out fairly early on that they were able to raise a lot of money and awareness by the scandal and the newspaper headlines that would put bodies on the cover and say, this is what happened down south. And once people saw this and they started learning about these cases, they were likely to donate and they were likely to get behind. They might not get excited about housing and voting rights, but they were willing to send checks when they saw young African Americans laying in a ditch, shot by a sheriff. And so Marshall recognized, not just from the public relations angle, and not only just from the fact that these were important cases that saved lives, these were important to the entire cause. A lot of people don't realize that Brown versus Board, that case was funded by the Groveland case. So much money was brought in over this 2-year period that this really happened, that they were able to fund Brown versus Board, which is the most important case in the 20th century.
Going back to Groveland and the citrus business angle, there was some sort of citrus boycott that Marshall was a part of. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Right, and I think that was one of the things that Marshall really realized, that he could not accomplish everything he wanted to accomplish through the law. And that's one of the things that occurred to me early on, because everyone associates Marshall with the law. But really, he was much more sophisticated than that. He helped organize this citrus boycott. And you would see in editorials and campaigns across the country the phrase, "Notice Negro blood on your grapefruit." And that sentence would cause people to read. And then they would read about this, and they were able to do a fairly effective boycott. They were able to do a travel boycott where in the late 40s and early 50s, Northerners were being made aware of these injustices. They didn't want to contribute to the economy of a Wild West mentality with the Klan and a wild sheriff were running around treating humans this way. And so he would do this. He would reach out to the clergy. Clergymen from every denomination were writing letters appealing to the politicians, to the newspapers, to look into this case. And it was sort of a 3 or 4 pronged attack, because there was only so much. You couldn't guarantee the Supreme Court would even hear these cases. The Supreme Court takes a very small percentage of cases that they see.
Now, we know that the internal workings of Lake County and Groveland did not play to Marshall's advantages, with the sheriff and the state attorney and everyone sort of being in each other's pocket. Did he appeal to higher forms of government? Did the federal government get involved? Did the higher state government get involved with not only Groveland but other cases in which I'm sure he tried to get help for?
Yeah, one of the things that Marshall tried to, and this is a very complicated part of the story, but it's actually really beautiful the way it plays out. And I'm talking about Thurgood Marshall's relationship with J. Edgar Hoover. You know, at first they really just hated each other. Marshall's complaint was, you seem to solve every single intercommerce case or every stolen car, but whenever there's a black man lynched in the South, it goes unsolved. How is that? We send our lawyers down there, and in 20 minutes they figure out who did these crimes. And so that was Marshall's big complaint. On J. Edgar Hoover's side, he did not like these civil rights cases. And the reason was pretty obvious. What would happen was he would send his investigators down. Sometimes they'd put together these airtight cases against these lynchers. They'd have them. It would be a local law enforcement, and they could not get indictments. The local communities would not indict. So the FBI would come out with these black eyes. They would say, the FBI is incompetent. And so every time he prosecuted one of these civil rights cases, they did not work out too well. So aside from J. Edgar Hoover's, I think he was disinterested in race relations to begin with, he definitely had a failure rate. But what he started to realize, and what Marshall realized, was that they did need each other. Marshall appealed to J. Edgar Hoover by keeping the communists out of the NAACP, allegedly. And so that appealed to J. Edgar Hoover's communist obsession. And on the other hand, Marshall would sometimes say, we appreciate everything the FBI is doing in this case. We're working closely with them, and we thank the FBI. And that, having a prominent civil rights person like Thurgood Marshall, that made J. Edgar Hoover feel better. And so they did this dance together where they cooperated, but I think realistically they did not like each other.
Time-wise, we're good, so I want to go back to the Groveland case a little bit. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the actual trial and how, you know, when we think of a trial, I think a lot of people look in terms of the modern trial that you got a fair jury, you got discovery in terms of evidence is going to be presented to you. Can you give us a little flavor of what Thurgood Marshall was dealing with in terms of not only making sure that his clients were alive and safe for the trial, but the trial and the atmosphere itself?
Right. And I think that's one of the things that I think people today in America are very sophisticated about the law. You can't turn on a cable news network and see some of these cases such as Trayvon Martin or, you know, the Dunn case and start to realize what happens. And you actually are almost following along with the trial and you know what can and cannot be done. Some of the things that Marshall was dealing with was, it turns out in this Groveland case, a physician had examined Norma Paget, the young woman who had made these accusations. Several hours after her allegations, a physician did a complete report and an examination, and Sheriff Willis McCall showed up and said, well, I want that report, and are you going to be able to testify that there's been a rape? And the physician says, I don't know. And you look at his report, and he concludes that there's no evidence showing any signs of rape. And so that was not something Sheriff McCall wanted to hear. And so what they did was, they just hid this witness. They did not submit the report. The prosecution said, we don't need a medical report. We have this young girl who's giving her word. She's sharing very personal details about her life. That is enough. And that was sort of how they presented it to the jury. And so a lot of these things, evidence was fabricated in this case. A lot of evidence was hidden. Marshall tried to subpoena certain things, and the judge just quashed it. So all of these things like evidentiary discovery, at the end of the trial, this is surprising, but I think most people know you can't do this in a trial. But the prosecutor, Jesse Hunter, is standing up there and he's arguing the closing case. He's been arguing against Thurgood Marshall, so he's a little bit worried about this. And he gets up to the jury railing and he leans forward to the 12 white jurors and he basically says, gentlemen of the jury, you all know me. Hate to have to tell you this, but I'm dying of a fatal disease and I don't want to go out with a loss on my record. And you know I wouldn't lie to you. And so he sort of says, and Marshall doesn't even object at this point. They're just making lists. They don't even bother because every time they object, so it's a strange thing to read this book and the first thing everyone says, you can't do that. No, they can't do that. Well, if the judge says you can, you can. And if the Florida Supreme Court says you can, you can. And you're very lucky to get it before the Supreme Court.
I don't want to give away too much of the book. But there's a part of the book I do want you to comment on, and we're going back before the trial. And it deals with Sheriff McCall and the power of these sheriffs. Again, I think you're quoted as one as saying that, Sheriff McCall made, some of these Southern sheriffs look like Barney Fife. I think
Right.
that's the quote. Could you talk to the I almost said jurors. Could you talk to the audience about the prisoners when they were transported and what happened, and what really I think is absolutely shocking as it dealt with Sheriff McCall and these prisoners?
Sure. Well, so Sheriff McCall starts out the story where he's actually a very heroic man. The Klan shows up at his jail. They know that the Groveland boys are in that jail, and they want to lynch them. Hundreds of them show up. They're heavily armed, and they say, "Willis, we want them boys." And there was no doubt what was going to happen to them. And McCall says, "No, we're going to stay here. They're going to go through a trial, and then they're going to be convicted and sent to the electric chair. That's the way it's going to work." And he holds them off. And the next day in the New York Times, he's got a headline that says, "Fast-talking sheriff saves prisoners from a lynching." So he starts out as this hero. But as he goes along, he's made this implicit bargain with the people of Lake County. He's basically saying, there's going to be no lynching, but make no mistake, they're going to the chair. We're going to try and convict them, and they're going. And so when the Supreme Court rules and overturns this verdict in Lake County, and Justice Robert Jackson says, he has this great quote in his opinion. He says, "This trial represents one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice." And it's a very strongly worded opinion about Lake County, the media, and the sheriff. And McCall's not pleased. He says, those pinkos up in Washington, D.C., they're getting in the way of Lake County justice. And so a new trial is ordered. Willis McCall says, "No problem. I'll go pick up the prisoners." And he drives up to Rayford, throws the prisoners in his car, handcuffs them, sends his deputy ahead in the car and turns down a dirt road, and basically gets out of the car and opens fire and kills one of the Groveland boys immediately. Walter Irvin, the man who wouldn't tell a lie, was pretending to be dead, and he survived 3 gunshot wounds and later told a story of cold-blooded murder. And so there were 2 versions, McCall's version and Irvin's version. And I saw the FBI files on this case, and the FBI was absolutely convinced that Walter Irvin was the one who was telling the truth from the forensic evidence, the bullets that were discovered. And so a coroner's jury was formed, and there were a coroner's jury of McCall's cronies and friends, and they cleared him. And because the coroner's jury was so thorough, the judge, same as the trial judge, Truman Futch, said there's no need to call a grand jury. The coroner's jury did a fantastic job. And so he got away with that. And the FBI actually hid the evidence.
When we think of Thurgood Marshall, and I know that there are those who think of him only as a Supreme Court justice, because that's the tail end of his career. How do you compare Thurgood Marshall to more of the mainstream civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and people of that nature? I mean, he doesn't get that same credit. I just want to know how you felt about that.
He really doesn't. And I think one of the things, and that's why this play is really important, because it really does touch on a Thurgood Marshall that a lot of people are not aware of. People are familiar with Brown versus Board of Education, familiar with the Supreme Court career, but there was an earlier time where Thurgood Marshall was Mr. Civil Rights. That was his nickname. And he was traveling around the South, and he provided the hope and inspiration for the race, the entire race. And, some people, there's one famous quote that says, Martin Luther King has a monument. The monument to Thurgood Marshall is the justice system we live in today. So it's a living, breathing monument, and I really do think that's his legacy. I really do think that the justice system that we know and appreciate, the way jurors take this seriously, has really been formulated by the work of Thurgood Marshall. And he doesn't have those iconic newsreel type speeches. He was an unbelievable speaker, extremely dynamic. You can listen to him online, listen to some of his arguments in Supreme Court cases, and it's a remarkable thing to listen to. There's a reason he won the majority of those Supreme Court cases. He was a tremendous intellectual and tremendous attorney. And you can see that and listen to that and hear it. And so I think we're not aware of it because we don't have these dynamic photographs and speeches on record, but we do have a history, and it's there.
There was a book that came out, The Brethren, which did not give a particularly flattering portrait of Thurgood Marshall as a justice. And I just wanted to know what your feelings were about that book and the comments that writer made about Thurgood, and whether or not they were fair.
Yeah, I really do not think they were fair. I think part of the book focused on Thurgood Marshall towards the end of his Supreme Court career. He was definitely elderly. He was, his health was failing him. He'd seen the Supreme Court, the dynamic of the court, turn to a very conservative court. And so his entire job on the Supreme Court, in a lot of cases, was writing dissents. And a lot of times he was writing dissents on cases that, you know, he had brought forward and seen progress in civil rights. And the court had shifted. And he was starting to see a lot of the work he had done sort of be erased. And so he actually put a lot of pressure on his own clerks as he was educating them to start writing opinions. And he was a tremendous editor. And the one thing I've met with a lot of his clerks, and the one thing they always wanted me to know was that they said the Thurgood Marshall that they remember was an extreme intellectual. He was very motivated. He'd just been sort of beaten down a little bit by health reasons, but he was very engaged. And every one of them are extremely loyal. Elena Kagan, who was one of his clerks, says the same thing, that she learned so much from this man, and he was an incredible justice, and he made some, he had written some great opinions, and he doesn't really get the credit for that, but I think we're starting to learn more about it.
Did you get a sense from researching him what he perceived himself as in terms of the overall civil rights struggle? Did he feel that he got enough credit? Did he feel he should have gotten more credit? What are some of the personal reflections you think he may have made about his life?
I think, you know, he was a very modest man, to believe it or not. And a lot of times when I've talked to the clerks, and if you read Sandra Day O'Connor's book, she writes about this as well. You know, a lot of the historians did not write about this particular Groveland case. It doesn't show up in a lot of civil rights literature. But the clerks that he would have lunch with in his office and the Supreme Court justices, they all knew the story because Marshall, those are the days that Marshall liked to remember. He was very fond of the work that he did in those early years. There's no Supreme Court justice who's back then who had actually been on murder trials and capital punishment trials. And that whole image of himself as a crusader for civil rights, I think, was the way he saw himself. And that's the Thurgood Marshall that the clerks remembered and the other Supreme Court justices remembered. So I think that was really his legacy.
What are some of the personal stories about him, or some of the things that you found that not a lot of people know about Thurgood Marshall?
Well, one of the stories I think was really touching to me. I went down to Howard University and they were having a moot court symposium, and a lot of his former clerks had returned to speak about the death penalty and a lot of the things that Thurgood Marshall was involved in and how to keep these issues going, from voting rights to school cases. And they invited the widow, Sissy Marshall, to attend. And she attended, and I found myself in the lobby at the same time as her, and everybody else had filed in. And she was about the last person to go in, and I was sort of lingering behind her, and the court session was about to begin. And right in front of the moot entrance, there's a bust of Thurgood Marshall that was sitting there. And Sissy Houston started walking into the symposium, and it was the sweetest thing. She just looked up at the bust, lifted her cane and just touched it gently, and she said, "Hey, buddy," and smiled. And I almost wanted to cry because I don't think she knew I was behind her. There was nobody else there. And it just sort of spoke to the relationship that they had and how fond they were of each other and how much she really missed him.
After he left the court, there is a part in the play, Thurgood, where someone asks him about Clarence Thomas, or it's inferred that it's Clarence Thomas, because the question is, do you think that you should be replaced by another African-American justice? And he makes the statement, or he tells the people, My daddy told me that a black snake would bite you just as much as a white snake. We don't really get an explanation as to what that means. We don't really know much about how he felt about his replacement. And I was just wondering if there's anything that you have found out or anything that you have researched to indicate how he felt not only about leaving the court, but about who his replacement should be.
It's interesting. That statement, I heard him make that earlier in his career. I think that was his way of saying he was just suspicious of both races. And one of the great quotes he says, and he says this to Harry T. Moore, who's the president of the NAACP, and he's working on these school cases down in Florida. And you know, these school cases are very complicated. And Marshall basically says, you know, sometimes the easy part of this job is fighting the white people. And what he really meant was it was complex. And, you know, and the reason that was because the NAACP was charging a $1 membership, and they wanted to raise it to $2. And what had happened was the success of the NAACP, they were beginning to get a lot of jobs for African Americans. For them to contribute now meant that they were sort of flying in the face of the establishment, and they didn't want to be seen as contributing to African American causes because it was considered as provocative. And so it presented a problem for Thurgood. So I think that statement really shows how he felt about race, and you couldn't yet necessarily look at a race and decide which way they went. As far as Clarence Thomas goes, I know that once he was replaced, Thurgood Marshall invited Clarence Thomas, and he had a very social meeting with him, and they chatted, and Clarence Thomas writes about it and said Thurgood Marshall was nothing but a gentleman. There's nothing on record as far as Thurgood saying anything about Clarence Thomas, but I think it's pretty clear that from the decisions and that I'm sure Marshall was not pleased at all. I think Marshall would have been probably upset, but he was such a gentleman that he wouldn't say it publicly.
You know, you spoke the other night, and there were some questions that the audience had about our progress since all of those times. And there are a lot of people that are still cynical about the civil rights movement, about ultimately what happened in Brown versus Board of Education. I've heard the comments that, you know, it didn't work, it wasn't worth it, things are as bad as they were. I just wanted to know your perspective, and if you could give us an idea how you think Thurgood Marshall would feel about how things are now, whether he'd be disappointed, whether he'd be optimistic about what's going on today.
Well, I think if you look back at Brown versus Board, I mean, that was a case that was basically 20 years in the making. That all started with the Margold report, which was written in, I think, the early 30s by a lawyer with the NAACP. And they put this plan in place, and it took 20 years to carry that plan out. You couldn't just make a Supreme Court case appear in the Supreme Court case and desegregate schools. It had to be, you know, laying bricks, basically. There had to be earlier decisions. Those had to be appealed. And that was a strategy that was really put in place by Charles Hamilton Houston. And he did not live to see that actually accomplished. But it's pretty impressive when you look at that report and you see the strategy followed almost to a T, 20 years. Would Marshall be disappointed in some of the things today? Of course he would. It was pretty obvious. But I think he also knew that, you know, a lot of these issues, they're not over when the Supreme Court rules. So Brown versus Board was decided in 1954. But you look at segregation cases here in Florida, they were being argued right up until the 70s. So, you know, it's that statement, with all deliberate speed. It wasn't that fast. There was a lot of, you know, feet dragging. And so these cases had to be continually litigated. Same with voting rights. You know, in 1944, they did away with the white primary in Texas. And that became the law of the land. But we're still seeing voting rights today, and these things are still being litigated. So I think Marshall would have felt that the bulk of the work was done, but it's not over yet. I think that's pretty much what he would have said, is that the fight has to continue, and there has to be the standing on the shoulders of giants, and there has to be young lawyers willing to litigate these things. That's why I think the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund is so important today, because they really continue to be the best and the brightest, If you're taking these cases before the Supreme Court, 13th, 14th Amendment cases, the Legal Defense Fund is who you want. That's Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston's legacy, and there's no better people.
As we wind this, this conversation down, I want you to comment on 2 words. Dude, Pulitzer.
Okay. Yeah.
What are those 2 words about?
Well, you might find this hard to believe. A lot of people really do. When you're nominated for, you don't know. I never knew. I had no idea. This was not on my radar. So I was playing golf in Lake County with an old high school friend.
The same Lake County where...
Same Lake County where this book takes place. And I was about to do a talk the next day at the Villages. A great big book club, as you can imagine. And I'm playing golf, and in the middle of the round, I look at it, I got a text, and it says 2 words, Dude, Pulitzer. And there was a link on there, and I clicked the link, and I started reading. It said, Adam Johnson has just won the Pulitzer for his novel, Orphan Master's Son. And I said, oh, I know Adam Johnson. That's why I got this text. They're telling me that my friend Adam has won for his novel. And then the next sentence, for nonfiction, Gilbert King's Devil in the Grove. And I thought it was a practical joke. And we were laughing about it. I thought my friend had made a fake article. And then, as the kids say, my phone exploded. I just, text after text, phone call was coming, and it was unbelievable. My friend wouldn't let it die. He was making fun of me the whole time. I said, I got to take these calls, Joe. And I said, look, the New York Times is calling. And my friend Joe said, tell him you already subscribe.
Now, your previous book, The Execution of Willie Francis, I'm sure that's being revisited. It's equally well received. What's next for you? And is there any follow-up to the Groveland Boys?
Yeah, I am actually working on a story now. I'm not sure it's going to be a book. I think it's going to be a long article. But a lot of it is sort of, it's just basically a follow-up. And it began with people who I'd met at book talks afterwards who would come up to me and they say, yeah, you got everything right in your book, but you didn't get everything. And they would talk to me about some of the cases that the same cast of characters were involved in, and some of the aftermath of Groveland that I was really unaware of, or some of the things were even in the newspapers that just remained unsolved. And so I started investigating some of this stuff, and it's pretty powerful stuff. It continues to involve the most powerful people of Lake County, and I think it's one of those stories that I think people who are familiar with this will be interested in, because it just speaks to a lot of the power issues. You know, after Sheriff McCall had shot these 2 men in a ditch, some of the people in the media were saying, well, that's it for his election. He's not going to get elected. And the special envoy to the governor said, are you kidding? He just bought himself a few extra terms. And in fact, Sheriff McCall would go on to serve until 1972. And it wasn't until he kicked to death a mentally retarded black prisoner in his cell and was indicted and forced to stand trial for murder that he finally lost the election. And he didn't lose by much. And as he was leaving, he said, I would have won if I didn't have that damn murder trial to go to.
I want to talk to you about a couple of people who don't get a lot of publicity and people don't know about, but thanks to your book, they are being revisited. And you mentioned Harry T. Moore earlier. Could you tell the audience who he is and what he did and why he's so important?
He's really important, and I think he's just not well known. And it's actually a travesty in a way, because I think people are familiar with the name Medgar Evers. They know that he was a field director in Mississippi in the 50s, and he was killed, assassinated. And he's a lot of times seen as the first civil rights martyr. Well, 10 years earlier, in the middle of this trial, Harry T. Moore, who was working with Thurgood Marshall on this case, Harry T. Moore was the president of the NAACP in Florida. He brought hundreds of thousands of African Americans onto the voting rolls. So he was registering voters, and that was seen as a tremendous threat to the establishment, the white establishment in Florida, because suddenly these politicians, these career politicians, suddenly saw a lot of voters who weren't going to vote for them. And it was through his efforts, basically alone, and through his work with the NAACP. In this particular case, he was working on basically keeping the heat on Willis McCall and letting the media and the politicians know that this was cold-blooded murder. And he became a thorn in Willis McCall's side. And so in the middle of this case, a bomb exploded underneath his house, killing both him and his wife, Harriet. So Harry T. Moore is really the first civil rights martyr in America. His house was in Mims, and his name just doesn't really show up. But his contributions to civil rights, and particularly to Florida, were imperative. He really changed the dynamic of Florida.
I'm going to ask in a moment for you to read a passage from your book, but what is it that you think we need to know about not only what happened in Groveland, but what we need to know about Thurgood and his legacy as those of us who have not seen the play will see it, and those of us who have seen the play?
Well, the one thing that I came away with this, and I was given access to not just the FBI files, but also to the Legal Defense Fund files, which was unusual because many historians, prominent historians, had requested these files for years, and nobody really had access to them. For some reason that I can't quite fully explain, the Legal Defense Fund granted me access to the files. So it sort of allowed me to be a fly on the wall in Thurgood's office to see how he conducted this case and many of the other cases that were occurring at the same time. And I pretty much decided early on that I was not going to sugarcoat anything, that I was going to just really present the truth to the best of my abilities. And whether you see a Thurgood Marshall who's drinking bourbon on the road or perhaps having affairs, which were part of his life at the time, that is in there, and I don't sugarcoat it. One of the things I thought to myself was, wow, if I'm going to get access to these files, I'm probably going to see things in the minutes to meetings and memos that maybe not be particularly flattering. Maybe there were some ethical corners that were cut. And time again, I would see instances where that might happen, and some of the other lawyers or advisors might make a suggestion of things that they could do to cut corners. And Thurgood Marshall every time would be that wall that would say, no, we're going to do this by the book. We cannot afford one single mistake. And I think that was what struck me the most. This man, you know, you can read about it in his book. He was the first man in the office and the last one to leave. He just literally realized he had to outwork everybody. And I could not find a single ethical lapse when I saw them all around in this particular case and these particular times. Thurgood Marshall was that one shining star that just refused to cut those corners. And I think that the entire civil rights movement benefited from that because of Thurgood Marshall's reputation. One judge says, you know, at one point they want to check the law because Thurgood Marshall has written this brief. And the white lawyers say, well, we need to check this. And the judge says, you don't need to check it. If Marshall wrote it and signed it, it's right. And I think that was sort of the legacy that he passed on to young lawyers in America to do things right.
As we close out this conversation, I'd ask that you would read a portion from your book.
Sure. Well, we talked about the danger that Marshall had faced going down south, a lot of times by himself. And basically the Klan would be waiting for him in a lot of these cases. You can read it in his diary entries. He was absolutely terrified at times. But one of the things he said constantly was that, yes, I'm afraid, but I'm not the hero in these stories. The heroes are the local activists and lawyers who, long after I step back on the train and head back up to New York, they stay behind and they have to live with this danger. And so I'm going to just sort of read a few paragraphs from this particular early prologue that sort of describe that a little bit. By the fall of 1951, Marshall had already filed and had begun trying in lower courts what would become his most famous case, Brown versus Board of Education, when he was again riding the rails toward Groveland. It was on such a journey to the south that one of Marshall's colleagues noticed the battle fatigue settling in on the lawyer. "You know," Marshall said to him, "sometimes I get awfully tired of trying to save the white man's soul." Battling personal demons, as well as the devils who brought bullets, dynamite, and nitroglycerin into the Groveland fray, the lawyer saw death all around him in Central Florida. So intense did the violence in Groveland become that on one of Marshall's visits, J. Edgar Hoover insisted that the FBI agents provide the NAACP attorney with around-the-clock protection. Usually, though, Marshall negotiated Florida alone, despite the number of death threats he daily received. A fellow NAACP lawyer thought of Marshall as a, quote, suicidal crusader because he involved himself in such explosive criminal cases in the South at an exceptionally crucial time in the history of the black struggle for equal opportunity. Suicidal or not, Marshall was unquestionably irreplaceable in the mission of the burgeoning civil rights movement, and Marshall's colleagues too got swept up in the enthusiasm and commitment. Quote, "Thurgood says he needs me," the NAACP associate told his wife. "If he needs me, I'm going. If I get killed, I get killed, but I gotta be on that train." The victories came only after many train rides to towns where no hotels or restaurants accommodated people of Marshall's race. Local blacks would welcome him, though, with hospitality and tears of gratitude. They'd clean their houses spotless for his stays. He'd join his hosts at their dinner tables and tell them stories from his travels that brought laughter to the night. He'd eat their modest offerings of salt pork and poke salad with such aplomb you'd think he was dining on his favorite she-crab soup over drinks with friends back in Harlem. The women would have lunches packed and delivered to him at court each day. Broken down cars would get glued together to taxi him back and forth. Later in the day, word would spread, quote, "Men are needed to sit up all night with a sick friend." You'd hear it whispered everywhere. They'd all know what it meant. They were lining up armed guards to keep Marshall safe from night-riding Klansmen while he slept. Alice Stovall, Marshall's secretary at the NAACP, recalled the effect Marshall had on blacks when he showed up at courthouses in small southern towns. Quote, "They came in their jalopy cars and their overalls," she recounted. "All they wanted to do, if they could, was just touch him. Just touch him. Lawyer Marshall, as if he were a god. These poor people who had come miles to be there." Southern juries might be stacked against blacks, and the judges might be biased, but Thurgood Marshall was demonstrating in case after case that their word was not the last, that in the U.S. Supreme Court, the injustice in their decisions and verdicts could be reversed. He was, quote, "a lawyer that a white man would listen to and a black man could trust." No wonder that across the South, in their darkest, most demoralizing hours, when falsely accused men sat in jails, when women and children stood before the ashy ruins of mob-torched homes, the spirits of black citizens would be lifted with two words whispered in defiance and hope: Thurgood's coming.
And with that, on behalf of all of us here at Florida Studio Theater and all of the people present, thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles. My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And so that you know, we are going to be exiting the theater. Mr. King will be outside. He will be able to autograph copies of this book that I hope all of you purchase, because it truly, truly is a treasure. So with that, thank you all for coming and for being here.
Thank you.
You got a
You should have a talk show.